There is a quiet kind of magic in the way old Hollywood stories glow. They flicker like warm candlelight, carrying the nostalgia of an era that looked polished, confident, and impossibly grand. For many people, those films shaped the rhythm of their childhood evenings, becoming a steady companion that whispered of dreams, courage, and lives larger than life. But as Ron Howard once reflected in an interview, the glow of that era was not as gentle as it appeared. Behind the iconic frames and the carefully composed smiles, there were shadows that no camera ever pointed toward. Howard said that people would never believe what some legends became once the lights dimmed and the audience disappeared. That quiet remark held more weight than any dramatic confession. It suggested that the Golden Age had been golden only for those who knew how to use its silence. Howard grew up surrounded by the machinery of Hollywood, and he watched the industry from a vantage point few could imagine. He saw the elegance that the world adored, but he also sensed the hidden tension that lived underneath. According to him, fame did not simply elevate certain stars, it protected them. It created a shield strong enough to turn wrong actions into convenient misunderstandings and to erase the pain of anyone who did not have the same privilege. In his words, the fantasy America consumed was built by people who sometimes crushed the spirits standing next to them, leaving stories buried in dressing rooms, studio offices, and long corridors where no camera ever dared to follow. As Howard grew older and began shaping films of his own, he returned to the histories of those legendary figures and discovered truths that disturbed him. Files, interviews, and testimonies revealed a pattern that stretched across decades. He realized that Hollywood had created its royalty, but it had also created its monsters. The industry celebrated brilliance on screen while remaining silent about the chaos off-screen. Over time, Howard understood that the era people romanticized was held together not by innocence, but by pressure, control, and a culture determined to protect its most profitable faces. This chapter begins with that understanding. It begins with the moment nostalgia cracks, letting the truth show through. Because, once Howard opened that door, the stories behind it refused to stay quiet any longer. The deeper Ron Howard went into the histories of old Hollywood, the more he understood that the darkness of the Golden Age did not come from isolated incidents. It came from patterns. It came from personalities that the system elevated without question and from a culture that allowed the worst impulses of certain icons to go unchecked for decades. The shadows were not accidents. They were consequences. And they had names. Errol Flynn was the first name that forced Howard to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the era. On screen, Flynn looked effortless, rebellious, and impossibly charismatic. He embodied the spirit of adventure with a smile that audiences trusted. Yet when Howard studied documents and court transcripts from the early 1940s, he found a man whose private world was filled with recklessness and disregard for those around him. Flynn arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1930s and rose to stardom almost overnight, but beneath that rise was a growing chaos. His charm became a shield, and the studios used it to build a fortune, all while ignoring the storms gathering behind his public persona. The turning point was the 1942 case involving two young women, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen. Newspapers turned the trial into a national spectacle, portraying Flynn as a victim of jealousy or as a predatory figure, depending on the headline. Warner Brothers hired powerful attorneys, and insiders whispered that witnesses felt pressure from people who stood to lose money if Flynn fell. In the courtroom, Flynn laughed, treating the proceedings as if they were beneath him. Although he was acquitted, the case left a fracture in the image that Hollywood tried to display. When Howard later discovered private letters from 1978 in which Flynn bragged about his behavior and mocked those who feared him, he understood that the issue was deeper than misconduct. It was about a system that gave certain men the confidence to believe consequences were optional. To Howard, Flynn represented the first lesson: charisma can hide a dangerous sense of entitlement. Kirk Douglas represented the second. Born Ishur Danilowitz, he did not grow up in glamour or wealth. He fought his way to the top with determination that bordered on ferocity. By the time Spartacus turned him into a global icon, he had everything he once dreamed of. But Howard learned that Douglas also carried a relentless sense of control and a temper that could destabilize an entire set. Crew members spoke of sudden outbursts and an intensity that made people afraid to make mistakes. Douglas wanted excellence, but he wanted it delivered without hesitation, without negotiation, and without resistance. Howard studied Douglas' performances closely during his early days as a filmmaker. He admired the power Douglas brought to a scene, yet he sensed a rage that never fully disappeared behind the character. Over time, Howard encountered stories from old Hollywood insiders discussing Douglas' troubling behavior toward women and references to allegations tied to the 1950s, including those mentioned by Natalie Wood's sister, Lana Wood, in a 2018 memoir. These accounts remain debated and unproven, but they revealed something crucial about the era. Hollywood operated behind a wall of silence. People whispered. People speculated. But few spoke openly, because the system rewarded those who protected its image. Douglas symbolized a different kind of danger from Flynn. Where Flynn hid behind charm, Douglas hid behind accomplishment. He was a reminder that success does not erase aggression. It sometimes magnifies it. Fay Dunaway completed the trio of revelations that shaped Howard's understanding of the Golden Age. Her performances in Bonnie and Clyde and Chinatown turned her into one of the most compelling figures of her generation. She possessed a cold, magnetic presence that audiences admired, but the stories behind the scenes painted a different portrait. Crew members described her as demanding, unpredictable, and relentless in her pursuit of perfection. On the set of Mommy Dearest, fear reportedly spread among the cast and crew as they waited for the next explosion of emotion. According to her co-star Rutanya Alda, Dunaway treated assistants as replaceable and reacted with fury at the smallest inconvenience. Howard later mentioned Dunaway as a symbol of a different kind of harm. Her cruelty was not loud or criminal. It was slow, emotional, and corrosive. It created environments where people worked not because they felt inspired, but because they feared the consequences of displeasing her. Dunaway's fall from Hollywood's grace came slowly, marked by productions that refused to hire her after years of tension. To Howard, she represented a truth that the industry rarely acknowledged. Not every destructive force arrives violently. Some arrive quietly, disguised as artistic devotion. By the time Howard completed his study of these three figures, he understood the foundation of the darkness he had sensed since childhood. These were not random stories. They were symptoms of a system that valued image over integrity, talent over humanity, and silence over accountability. As Ron Howard explored more of Hollywood's past, he discovered that the darker stories did not exist in isolation. They were woven into the very structure of the industry, protected by silence and amplified by the complex machinery that surrounded its biggest stars. The system was designed to elevate icons, not to hold them accountable. When a powerful figure acted without restraint, the studios did not challenge them. Instead, they shielded them, reshaped the narrative, and allowed their influence to grow until it became impossible to distinguish admiration from fear. The next names Howard studied revealed exactly how far-reaching that culture had been. John Wayne represented the clearest example of how an actor could become larger than the industry itself. To millions of Americans, Wayne symbolized strength, patriotism, and unwavering resolve. He became an embodiment of the national identity, a figure who shaped public imagination long after his films left the screen. But as Howard uncovered interviews, set testimonies, and notes from directors who worked with Wayne, he realized that the aura surrounding the man had overshadowed the truth. Wayne was not simply confident. He was demanding, domineering, and unyielding. Cast and crew members recalled how his anger dominated the atmosphere of a set, freezing conversations and silencing disagreements. According to actor Christopher Mitchum, when Wayne grew angry, the air itself seemed to harden, leaving everyone aware of the unspoken hierarchy that governed the room. Howard was particularly disturbed by Wayne's 1971 interview in Playboy. a conversation that revealed harsh, prejudiced views regarding indigenous communities and Black Americans. Wayne dismissed social progress and positioned himself as the guardian of an older, exclusive worldview. Howard later reflected that the most unsettling part was not the interview itself, but the industry's reaction. Hollywood had built Wayne into an icon so untouchable that even his most controversial statements failed to disrupt his standing. He became the symbol of a system that rewarded unwavering confidence even when it crossed into intolerance. Howard saw Wayne as proof that the Golden Age's myths were constructed with deliberate blindness. Roman Polanski reflected another form of that blindness. His early life was marked by tragedy, loss, and survival, experiences that shaped him into a filmmaker with a distinctive sense of psychological tension. Howard admired Polanski's cinematic skill long before he understood the weight of the man's actions. When the 1977 case came to light, detailing Polanski's unlawful conduct with a minor, Howard experienced a profound shift. The evidence was overwhelming, and Polanski's own admission carried significant legal implications. Yet the industry's response was divided. Some defended him as a misunderstood artist, while others condemned him entirely. The split became a reflection of Hollywood's cultural fracture, an industry that struggled to separate artistic admiration from moral accountability. When Polanski fled the United States before sentencing and continued directing films in Europe, Hollywood faced one of its most uncomfortable mirrors. The question was no longer about Polanski alone, but about the people who continued to celebrate his work despite the severity of the case. In 2003, when the pianist won an Academy Award, Howard remembered sitting motionless as the audience around him applauded. He imagined the experience from the perspective of the young girl involved in the case and questioned how loudly the industry valued artistic legacy over personal responsibility. To Howard, Polanski represented the moment when Hollywood's protective shield became undeniably visible. Mickey Rooney revealed the final layer of the media avalanche, the illusion of innocence. Rooney had been Hollywood's original child superstar, the face that audiences loved and studios relied on for box office success. But as Howard examined archival notes, interviews, and memoirs from those who worked with Rooney, he uncovered a far more chaotic reality. Behind the bright smile was a man battling addiction, impulsive decisions, and volatile relationships. His closest collaborators described a pattern of emotional harm, including accounts from Judy Garland, who hinted that Rooney contributed to the immense pressure she faced during her formative years at MGM. As Rooney aged, the consequences of his turmoil became more apparent. Financial troubles accumulated, personal relationships collapsed, and allegations emerged concerning the mishandling of his finances by those closest to him. When he passed away with almost no savings and a life marked by regret, Howard saw the story not as an isolated tragedy, but as a demonstration of how the industry constructed and consumed its legends. Rooney showed that the Golden Age did not merely hide cruelty. It also created wounds that lasted long after the applause faded. By the time Howard completed his study of Wayne, Polanski, and Rooney, he understood the sheer scale of the avalanche. It was not about individual misdeeds or isolated scandals. It was about a culture that allowed fame to reshape the truth and permitted powerful figures to operate without consequence. Hollywood was not simply a factory of dreams. It was a fortress that protected the narratives it needed and buried the ones it feared. By the time Ron Howard reached the final layer of his research, he realized that the stories he had uncovered were not simply accounts of individual failures. They were reflections of an entire ecosystem that had allowed these failures to shape the emotional landscape of old Hollywood. The further he looked, the more the illusions of his childhood dissolved. The Golden Age did not crumble because of a single scandal. It cracked under the weight of decades of silence, ambition, and unchecked power. This realization became the turning point, the moment when Howard understood that the truth he had uncovered was not merely historical. It was structural. Howard often described his younger self as a child who believed in the elegance of the movies he watched. He believed in the smiles, the neat resolutions, and the heroes who carried the American imagination. But as he grew older and began directing films of his own, he sensed a tension beneath the stories people celebrated. He saw how easily admiration could become blindness, and how quickly a legend could overshadow those who lived in their shadow. When he revisited the files of Flynn, Douglas, Dunaway, Wayne, Polanski, and Rooney, he found not 6 isolated figures but 6 doors that opened into the same room. The climax arrived when Howard compared these stories side by side and noticed the same recurring details. It did not matter whether the behavior came from charm, rage, ego, prejudice, or emotional chaos. The outcome was always similar: the industry bent to the will of its most profitable figures. Studio executives intervened in trials. Crew members stayed silent out of fear. Directors compromised their vision to protect their careers. Even audiences participated, embracing the on-screen brilliance while ignoring the off-screen behavior that made it possible. Howard realized that the Golden Age survived because people wanted the fantasy more than the truth. What disturbed him most was how often talent was used as justification. Flynn's charisma, Douglas' intensity, Dunaway's devotion to craft, Wayne's authority, Polanski's cinematic brilliance, Rooney's charm. Each of these qualities created a kind of cultural immunity, allowing their shadows to stretch far beyond the reach of accountability. Howard understood that the industry did not simply overlook their actions, it relied on those actions to maintain its mythology. This was the heart of the breakthrough. The Golden Age was never golden. It was curated. It was edited. It was illuminated only in the places where the studios allowed the light to land. Howard spoke about this shift in perspective years later, explaining how it changed the way he approached his own career. He believed that filmmaking should elevate people, not erode them. He believed that leadership required empathy, not intimidation. In his view, the future of Hollywood depended on recognizing the human cost of its past. He saw that the industry could no longer afford the silence that once defined it. The younger generation of actors, directors, and crew members deserved a space where talent did not replace accountability and where success did not require emotional sacrifice. The breakthrough did not arrive with anger or bitterness. It arrived with clarity. Howard recognized that understanding these stories was not about condemning the past. It was about preventing its repetition. The tales of Flynn, Douglas, Dunaway, Wayne, Polanski, and Rooney became a map of warning signs: charisma without restraint, ambition without empathy, brilliance without responsibility. He reflected on how these figures shaped the culture he inherited and how their legacies continued to influence the present. Hollywood had changed, but some of its shadows remained. In one interview, Howard said that the most haunting realization was not the scandal, the cruelty, or even the tragedies. It was the silence that allowed everything to happen. Silence from the industry, silence from colleagues, silence from a society unwilling to question the people it admired. He understood that the true climax of the Golden Age was not a scandal or a downfall. It was the moment when the curtain finally lifted, revealing that the mythology had been built on fragile foundations. By confronting these truths, Howard found a sense of purpose. He believed that the path forward required light, honesty, and the willingness to question the stories people hold dear. And in that clarity, he saw the beginning of a new era, shaped not by illusions, but by the courage to face the shadows that old Hollywood left behind. When Ron Howard reached the end of his long journey through Hollywood's hidden past, he understood that the stories he uncovered were not just echoes from another era. They were lessons carved into the foundation of an industry that had spent decades shaping the dreams of millions. The Golden Age, often remembered with admiration and nostalgia, was far more complicated than the world believed. It was an era filled with brilliant performances and unforgettable cinema, but it was also built on the silence that allowed its darkest moments to thrive. Howard believed that the true measure of history was not in how warmly it was remembered, but in how honestly it was understood. He often reflected on how the legends of the past represented two entirely different worlds. On screen, they symbolized charm, justice, romance, and courage. Off-screen, many of them carried shadows that affected the people who worked beside them and the lives that intersected with theirs. Howard believed that acknowledging these contradictions did not diminish the beauty of their films. Instead, it provided a more complete view of the industry that created them. It allowed people to appreciate the art while understanding the cost that some individuals paid to make it possible. In examining the downfall, struggles, and controversies surrounding Flynn, Douglas, Dunaway, Wayne, Polanski, and Rooney, Howard recognized a pattern that extended far beyond the names themselves. Each story revealed how power could distort accountability, how talent could overshadow harm, and how the industry once prioritized image over integrity. The aftermath of these revelations did not simply reshape Howard's understanding of history. It reshaped his belief in what Hollywood needed to become. Howard viewed the modern industry as a landscape, slowly learning from the past. Conversations that were once considered dangerous or disrespectful were now essential to building a healthier environment. The silence that once protected the powerful was beginning to fracture, allowing truth to rise in places where it once had no voice. Howard believed that progress required remembering, not forgetting. It required the courage to examine the mistakes that built the mythology and the strength to demand something better for the generations who would inherit the craft. As he looked back at the legends whose names had shaped the Golden Age, Howard knew that their legacies would forever remain complex. They built stories that inspired millions, but they also left behind lessons written in the shadows of their actions. The industry they helped create now faced the responsibility of deciding which parts of that legacy to preserve and which parts to leave behind. Howard once said that the most important truth he learned was simple. The scariest monsters are not in horror films. They are the ones the spotlight protects. And in remembering that, Hollywood has a chance to build an era defined not by silence, but by clarity, compassion, and the courage to face its own reflection.